It didn't end the way the simulations predicted. The vidscreens, the frantic projections from high command, the dire warnings from the AI strategists, they had all painted a picture of fire and ruin, of a glorious, doomed last stand. They promised a crescendo of plasma fire, the roar of dying engines, the defiant screams of the 88th Mechanized Infantry broadcast across the Sol system as they were overwhelmed. War, even in its most brutal and final moments, was supposed to have a sound. It was supposed to be a symphony of chaos, a testament to the fight. But the end of the battle for Sector Gamma 9, the designated buffer zone protecting the inner colonies, was not loud. It was silent. The silence was the most terrifying part. One moment, the comms channels were a cacophony of desperation. The frantic, overlapping shouts of squad leaders trying to rally their positions against an enemy that defied all tactical analysis. The staccato rhythm of pulse cannons firing until their energy cells ran dry. The sharp, metallic crack of alien weaponry that sounded like tearing fabric, each rip in the soundscape followed by a human voice abruptly cut short. We heard the final, garbled transmission from Commander Valerius, his voice strained not with fear, but with a chilling sense of disbelief. They aren't breaking through, they're just walking through us. It's not a fight, it's a harvest. God forgive. And then, nothing. The channel hissed with the empty static of deep space, a sound that suddenly felt heavier, more profound than any explosion. Across the Aegis Wall, the next and last line of defense, we watched the data streams die one by one. First, the forward sensor arrays went dark. Then the platoon-level biomonitors flatlined in perfect, horrifying synchronicity. Finally, the main command feed from the Gamma 9 orbital platform simply ceased to exist. It didn't flicker or corrupt. It vanished as if a switch had been flipped. The entire sector, a sprawling expanse of reddish dust, prefabricated fortifications, and the bodies of 10,000 of our best soldiers, fell into an electronic and auditory void. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy blanket thrown over a screaming victim. It was a silence that felt engineered, deliberate. It was the sound of a predator that had finished its meal and was now sitting back, watching, waiting. For 72 standard hours, that silence held. The War Council on Titan convened and disbanded 3 times, unable to formulate a response to an enemy that left no wreckage, no energy signatures, nothing but a void where a battle was supposed to have been. Reconnaissance drones sent to pierce the veil of Gamma 9 either vanished from tracking or returned with corrupted data, their optical sensors showing nothing but swirling, rust-colored dust. It was a ghost sector. The official reports, sanitized for public consumption, spoke of a tactical retreat, a strategic consolidation of forces. But we, the soldiers stationed on the Aegis Wall, knew the truth. We had listened to the final screams. We had seen the lights go out. You don't strategically consolidate 10,000 soldiers into absolute silence. The psychological toll of that quiet was immense. On the wall, every soldier was a coiled spring of anxiety. We stared out at the vast, empty expanse of Gamma 9, our high-powered scopes and long-range sensors showing us nothing but a landscape of unnatural stillness. The wind, kicking up plumes of iron-rich dust, was the only sound, and it felt like a profanity, an unwelcome intrusion into the sacred, terrible quiet. We were trained for the noise of battle, for the adrenaline of combat. We were not trained for this. We were not prepared for a vigil over a graveyard we couldn't see, a graveyard where the enemy might still be lurking, watching us from beneath the shroud of its perfect, suffocating silence. The war had been raging for 3 years, a brutal, grinding conflict against the harvesters, as we'd nicknamed them. We had fought them on asteroids, in the rings of gas giants, and on desolate moons. We had lost ships, colonies, and friends. But we had always fought. We had always made noise. This was different. This was an erasure. This was the enemy showing us they could not only kill us, but they could delete us from existence, leaving behind nothing but a question mark and a silence that screamed louder than any weapon in our arsenal. It was the silence of the tomb, and we were the ones standing guard outside, waiting for whatever was inside to finally show itself. The first sign of the true horror came not from a visual sensor or a scout drone, but from the cold, sterile data logs of the medical frigate Hippocrates, stationed in a high orbit overlooking the Aegis Wall. Its primary mission post-battle was grimly passive: to monitor Sector Gamma 9 for residual radiation, chemical signatures, or any other lingering threats that might drift towards our position. Its secondary, unspoken mission was to act as a long-range morgue, cataloging the dead from a safe distance, confirming the 10,000 casualties for the official record. The ship's bioscanners, powerful enough to detect the faint electrical signature of a human nervous system from thousands of kilometers away, had been sweeping the silent battlefield for 3 days. The results were consistently, depressingly null. 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 extinguished life signs. A digital graveyard confirming the physical one below. Then, on the 4th day, the anomaly occurred. A junior tech, a young ensign named Kenji, was running the routine diagnostic sweep when a single, impossible data point appeared on his screen. It was a flicker, a tiny blip of green on a sea of red. A single human biosignature, faint and erratic, but undeniably present, originating from the heart of the Gamma 9 kill zone. His first thought was that it was a sensor ghost, a common glitch caused by solar flares or gravitational distortions. He ran a Level 1 diagnostic. The signal remained. He escalated to a Level 2 deep system check. The signal stabilized, becoming stronger, clearer. It was real. He called over his superior, a grizzled chief petty officer who had seen too many false hopes in his 30 years of service. The CPO grumbled, expecting another false alarm, another piece of malfunctioning equipment to curse. He peered at the screen, his skepticism melting into confusion, then into a tense, focused alertness. He ordered Kenji to recalibrate the entire scanner array and focus it on the signal's point of origin. The process took 20 minutes, an eternity of charged silence in the Hippocrates' dimly lit bridge. When the system came back online, the screen was no longer showing a single blip. It was showing dozens, then hundreds. Then, as the array widened its scope, thousands. A wave of impossible green washed over the tactical map of Sector Gamma 9. Life signs, flickering to life where there had been only death. They weren't strong, not the robust, steady signals of healthy soldiers. They were weak, thready, like the fluttering heartbeat of a dying bird. But they were there. Thousands of them, appearing in clusters, mirroring the last known positions of the 88th Mechanized Infantry's platoons. It was a resurrection, a digital miracle broadcast from the depths of hell. The CPO, a man not known for sentiment, was seen making the sign of an old-world cross over his chest. Hope, a dangerous and long-forgotten commodity, began to spread through the ship. Could there have been survivors? Could the harvesters have taken prisoners? Could our soldiers have found a way to shield themselves, to wait out the storm? The news reached the Aegis Wall like an electric shock. The initial reports were fragmented, passed down through the command chain in hushed, excited whispers. They're detecting life signs. Survivors in Gamma 9. The 88th might not be a total loss. For a moment, the heavy shroud of grief and dread was lifted. A cautious optimism, fragile and tentative, bloomed in the sterile corridors and fortified bunkers of the wall. We imagined our comrades, battered and wounded, but alive, waiting for rescue. We envisioned medevac ships storming into the sector, a triumphant return from the brink of annihilation. The silence from Gamma 9 was reinterpreted. It wasn't the silence of the dead. It was the silence of the hidden, the patient, the survivors. But in the high-security labs of the Aegis Wall and on the bridge of the Hippocrates, the scientists and senior analysts were not celebrating. They were watching the data with a growing sense of profound unease. The biosignatures were wrong. They lacked the subtle, chaotic rhythm of natural life. They were pulsing in a strange, synchronized pattern, like a string of holiday lights being switched on and off. Furthermore, the signals were originating from bodies that had been confirmed as Kia through their own suit telemetry. The system was cross-referencing the locations with the casualty logs, and every single re-emerging life sign was coming from a soldier who was officially, verifiably dead. Their suits had reported catastrophic breaches, zero oxygen, and flatlined heart rates 3 days ago. It was a biological and technological impossibility. The data was telling two contradictory stories, one of a miraculous resurrection and another of an army of corpses coming back to life. The hope that had so briefly illuminated the darkness began to curdle into a new, more terrible kind of. Sergeant Eva Rostova felt the news of the Gamma-9 survivors not as a wave of hope, but as a cold, sharp object twisting in her gut. For 3 days, she had existed in a state of suspended grief, a hollowed-out shell propped up by routine and military discipline. Her post was a sniper's nest carved into the ferrocrete face of the Aegis Wall, a small, cramped space filled with the smell of ozone from the charging cells of her rifle and the faint, metallic tang of recycled air. From this perch, she had an unobstructed view of the rust-colored plains of Sector Gamma-9. It was her job to watch, to be the first pair of eyes to see a threat emerge from that silent expanse. But her watch was also a penance, a self-imposed vigil. Out there, somewhere in that swirling dust, was what was left of her younger brother, Alek. He had been part of the 88th, a fresh-faced private, barely 20 years old, full of the naive conviction that he was fighting for the future of humanity. Eva, already a veteran of the brutal skirmishes in the asteroid belt, had tried to temper his idealism with a dose of harsh reality. She had taught him how to clean his rifle, how to read enemy patterns, how to distinguish the sound of incoming plasma from friendly fire. She had failed to teach him how to survive. His last transmission to her, sent just hours before the silence fell, was a shaky, handheld video. His face, smudged with grime, was split by a wide, nervous grin. "Don't worry about me, Eva," he'd said, the roar of distant battle a low rumble in the background. "I'm with the best. We'll hold the line. See you on the other side." Then the feed had cut out and the silence had come for him. Eva was a product of the war, forged in its fires. She was pragmatic, hardened, her emotions locked away behind layers of scar tissue and training. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford, a vulnerability that could get her and her new squad killed. So she channeled it into a cold, obsessive focus. She spent her off-duty hours in the nest, her eye pressed to the optical scope of her stanchion-class railgun, scanning the horizon. She wasn't looking for the enemy. She was looking for him. For some sign, some piece of wreckage, some glint of light off his helmet that would give her a place to direct her sorrow. She found nothing. The landscape remained stubbornly, maddeningly empty. When the whispers of survivors began to circulate, her squad mates had clapped her on the shoulder, their faces bright with relief. "Hear that, Rostova? Maybe your brother's one of 'em." The kid was tough. Eva had just nodded, her expression unreadable. But inside, the cold knot of dread tightened. It didn't make sense. The harvesters didn't leave survivors. They didn't take prisoners. Their tactics were built on total annihilation, on erasing every trace of resistance. This miracle felt wrong, like a trap being laid with the most painful bait imaginable. She trusted her instincts more than she trusted the hopeful chatter on the comms. Her instincts had kept her alive when tactics and technology had failed, and right now they were screaming at her. She pulled up Alek's file on her datapad for the 100th time. Private Alek Rostova. Status, Kia. His suit's final telemetry packet was stark and brutal. Multiple plasma punctures to the torso, catastrophic life support failure, zero brain activity. Confirmed. Final. There was no ambiguity. Yet, the medical frigate was now claiming that thousands of soldiers just like him were suddenly showing signs of life. She turned back to her scope, dialing the magnification to its maximum, the motors in the housing whining softly. The dust storms had subsided slightly, offering a clearer, if still distorted, view of the distant battlefield. She scanned the terrain methodically, grid by grid, just as she had been doing for days. She ignored the hopeful chatter in her earpiece, filtering it out as background noise. She was looking for the truth, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the truth would not be a miracle. It would be a nightmare. The silence of Gamma 9 had been a promise of death. The new signals, the impossible heartbeats of the fallen, felt like something far worse. It felt like a desecration. And as she kept her lonely watch, staring into the heart of that impossible resurrection, Sergeant Eva Rostova prepared herself not for a rescue, but for a haunting.
The vigil ended on the 5th day. The impossible biosignatures had been pulsing on the tactical maps for 48 hours, a source of frantic debate between High Command's optimism and the Aegis Wall's growing dread. Then, the long-range motion sensors pinged, a single sustained alert. Something was moving out there. Something was coming. On the command deck of the Aegis Wall, a hush fell. All eyes turned to the main view screen, which now showed a live feed from a high-altitude drone. The image was grainy, distorted by atmospheric interference, but it was clear enough. A lone figure was walking, stumbling, out of the rust-colored haze of Sector Gamma 9. It was moving with a slow, unsteady gait, a silhouette against the swirling dust. It was heading directly for the wall. "Magnify and clarify, now!" Commander Thorne's voice cut through the tense silence. The image sharpened. The figure was human, or at least, it had the shape of a human. It was wearing the tattered, scorched remains of the 88th Mechanized Infantry's combat armor. Its helmet was missing, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. It didn't walk like a soldier, or even like a wounded survivor. It moved with the lurching, uncoordinated motion of a marionette with tangled strings. "Identify him," Thorne ordered, his voice tight. The image was cross-referenced with the 88th's personnel files. Facial recognition software struggled with the poor quality of the feed, but after a few tense seconds, a match came back. A file appeared on the screen. Private Leo Tereshkov, a young soldier from the SETI colonies. Pictured next to his name was a smiling, bright-eyed young man, full of life. The figure on the screen was a grotesque parody of that photo. Its face was gaunt, its skin an unhealthy, grayish pallor, its eyes vacant and staring. And next to his name, in stark red letters, was the same designation Eva Rostova knew so well. KIA, confirmed. His suit had reported terminal life support failure 4 days prior. A wave of confusion and disbelief washed over the command deck. "It's a mistake," someone muttered. "The file has to be wrong." But they all knew the system didn't make mistakes like that. The telemetry data was absolute. On her perch, Eva Rostova watched the same feed on her helmet's display. She saw the name Tereshkov. She remembered him, a quiet kid who played the harmonica during downtime, filling their sterile barracks with sad, soulful melodies. She had shared a meal with him just before the 88th deployed. Now, she was watching his ghost walk out of the desert. Her hands, usually rock-steady, trembled slightly as she gripped her rifle. The cold dread in her stomach had solidified into a block of ice. This was it. The trap was being sprung. The figure of Tereshkov continued its slow, shambling march. It didn't respond to hails. The wall's powerful communication arrays beamed every known friendly greeting, every emergency code, every plea for a response. The soldier didn't react. He just kept walking, his path unwavering. He was a homing beacon of wrongness. High Command, viewing the events from the safety of Titan, saw a different picture. They saw a survivor, a miracle. A symbol of hope to be broadcast across the colonies, a much-needed morale boost in a losing war. The order came down, overriding the cautious objections of Commander Thorne on the wall. "Retrieve him. Bring him in. He is a Priority 1 asset." The message was clear. The political value of a survivor outweighed the tactical risks. A heavy gate at the base of the Aegis Wall groaned open, and a small, heavily armed retrieval team moved out. They were clad in full biohazard gear, their movements tense and wary. They approached the stumbling figure of Tereshkov with caution, their weapons raised. From the command deck, we watched on the drone feed as they flanked him. "Private Tereshkov?" The team leader's voice crackled over the comms. "Can you hear me? We're here to help." The figure of Tereshkov didn't respond. It didn't even seem to notice them. It just kept walking, its vacant eyes fixed on the open gate of the wall. The team leader reached out and placed a hand on the soldier's shoulder. The figure stopped. For a moment, there was absolute stillness. Then, with a speed that was utterly inhuman, its head snapped around to face the team leader. The drone's camera zoomed in, and for a horrifying second, we saw Tereshkov's eyes. They were not the eyes of a man. They were like polished stones, empty and devoid of any light, any soul. The feed crackled with static, and the team leader let out a sharp, involuntary cry of shock. The miracle had come home, and it had brought the chill of the grave with it. The retrieval team brought Private Tereshkov in. The official term was escorted, but the visual feed told a different story. They didn't guide him. They herded him. He moved with a compliant, unnerving passivity, his shambling gait never faltering, his vacant eyes never blinking. He ignored their questions, their commands, their presence. It was like trying to communicate with a rock. The soldiers of the retrieval team, their voices strained and hushed over the comms, spoke of an unnatural cold that seemed to radiate from him, a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. They guided him through the massive inner blast doors and into a pre-prepared high-security quarantine bay in the wall's medical wing. The doors hissed shut behind him, sealing him away from the rest of the base, a specimen under glass. To the wider Sol system, it was a moment of triumph. High Command's propaganda machine went into overdrive. Edited clips of Tereshkov's rescue were broadcast on every public channel. They carefully cut around the jerky, unnatural movements, the vacant stare, the clear reluctance of the retrieval team. They presented a narrative of incredible resilience, of a lone hero emerging from the ashes of defeat. He was dubbed the Miracle of Gamma 9, a symbol of humanity's unbreakable spirit. His face, the old file photo of the smiling, vibrant young man, was plastered everywhere. For millions of civilians and demoralized soldiers on other fronts, it was a potent injection of hope. The 88th had not been erased. They had endured. But inside the Aegis Wall, there was no celebration. There was only a deepening sense of dread. The medical wing was locked down, placed under Level 4 biohazard protocol. Guards armed with plasma incinerators stood watch outside the quarantine chamber, their faces grim. The miracle was being treated like a plague carrier. The disconnect between the official story and the reality we were living was jarring and deeply unsettling. We were being told to celebrate a hero, while our commanders were preparing for an outbreak. Inside the sterile, white-walled chamber, Tereshkov stood in the center of the room, perfectly still. He didn't sit. He didn't explore his surroundings. He just stood there, a statue carved from dead flesh, his head cocked at a slight, unnatural angle. A battery of automated medical scanners whirred around him, taking readings, analyzing his biology from a safe distance. The initial data that filtered out to the medical staff was baffling, a string of contradictions that defied medical science. His body was healing. The plasma wounds that had supposedly killed him, the catastrophic punctures recorded by his suit's telemetry, were closing. The flesh was knitting itself back together at a rate that was simply impossible. Scar tissue was forming in minutes, not weeks. Yet this accelerated regeneration was selective, grotesque. It was healing the structural damage, but it was not restoring life. His body temperature was well below the human norm, hovering just a few degrees above freezing. His skin had the pallor and texture of a corpse that had been left in a morgue for several days. There was no discernible electrical activity in his cerebral cortex, the part of the brain responsible for thought, personality, and consciousness. According to the scans, the man in the room was, for all intents and purposes, brain dead. He was a walking, healing corpse. The soldiers who had been on the wall long enough, the veterans of other grim campaigns, started to whisper an old dark term from the early days of the war, a name for an enemy tactic that had only been rumored, never confirmed. They called it the Ghost Protocol. A legend about how the harvesters didn't just kill their enemies, they used them. They turned our own fallen soldiers into weapons, puppets animated by some unseen alien technology. It was a story told to frighten rookies, a campfire tale from the front lines. Now, as we watched the impossible data scroll across the screens and stared at the still, cold figure of Private Tereshkov standing in his sterile prison, the legend felt terrifyingly real. The miracle in the quarantine bay was not a survivor. It was evidence. It was the prologue to a horror story that was just beginning to unfold. If the Aegis Wall had a high priest of bad news, it was Dr. Eris Thorn. He was not a medical doctor, but a xenobiologist, a man who had dedicated his life to studying the alien physiology of the harvesters. He was a gaunt, perpetually weary man with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent staring at incomprehensible data. He had been brought to the wall to find a weakness in the enemy. Instead, he had only found a deeper, more profound understanding of their utter alienness. He viewed the universe not with wonder, but with a biologist's cold, unsentimental pragmatism. And when he was summoned to the quarantine bay to examine Private Tereshkov, he brought with him a heavy sense of professional dread. Hope was an emotional variable he had learned to discard from his equations. He didn't enter the chamber. He stood in the observation room, separated from the survivor by 3 inches of reinforced plasteel. The room was a mess of data screens, each displaying a different aspect of Tereshkov's impossible biology. Thorn ignored the jubilant, speculative messages coming in from high command. He focused only on the raw data, and the data was telling him a story of profound violation. "Look at the cellular regeneration," he murmured, more to himself than to the anxious medical staff around him. "It's not biological. It's mechanical. Nanites." He pointed to a magnified image of Tereshkov's tissue. Tiny metallic specks, almost invisible, were swarming around the damaged cells, stitching them together like microscopic weavers. "They're not healing him. They're repairing him. Like a machine. They're patching the holes, reinforcing the structure, but they're not restoring the function of the living tissue. It's just meat and bone being held together by alien technology." His eyes darted to another screen, this one showing the energy readings. There's no metabolic activity. He's not consuming energy, not processing nutrients. He's a corpse, but he's being powered by an external source. He traced a faint energy signature with his finger on the screen. It was a low-level wave of an unknown type, emanating from somewhere deep inside Tereshkov's body. It was the energy that was driving the nanites. The energy that was keeping the body upright and mobile. Thorn ordered a deep tissue scan, focusing on the brainstem. This was the most primitive part of the brain, the root of all autonomic functions: breathing, heartbeat, motor control. The scan took several long, tense minutes. When the image resolved on the main screen, a collective gasp went through the observation room. Fused to the top of Tereshkov's spinal column, wrapped around his medulla oblongata like a metallic parasite, was a small, intricate device. It was a mesh of organic-looking fibers and gleaming, non-human metal, pulsating with a soft, sickly green light. It was clearly not human technology. It was a harvester artifact. "That's it," Thorn whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. "The puppet master." He realized instantly what he was looking at. It was a control node, a biomechanical interface designed to hijack a host's nervous system. It had bypassed the dead cerebral cortex entirely, plugging directly into the body's motor controls. Tereshkov wasn't a survivor. He was a vehicle, a biological drone being piloted by an alien operator. The full, terrifying implication of the discovery settled over Thorn like a shroud. This wasn't just about one soldier. The bioscanners were still showing thousands of life signs out in Gamma 9. If Tereshkov was a puppet, then it was likely they all were. An entire army of our own dead, repaired, repowered, and waiting for a command. The single soldier wasn't a miracle. He was a herald. He was a proof of concept, sent ahead to test the response, to walk right through the front door. And they had let him in. They had opened the gates and welcomed the Trojan horse, celebrating it as a gift. Dr. Thorn looked at the still figure of Tereshkov, the empty vessel standing in the room, and then at the tactical map, alight with the green signals of the dead. His dread was no longer a feeling, it was a certainty. The real first wave of the attack on the Aegis Wall had not even begun. The discovery of the parasitic node shifted the focus of Dr. Thorne's investigation from biology to technology. The question was no longer, what is keeping him alive? But what is controlling him? The node itself was a dead end. It was clearly a receiver, not a transmitter. It was an antenna, waiting for a signal. Thorne's team immediately began a frantic search for that signal, turning the wall's powerful sensor arrays inward, scanning the quarantine bay for any trace of an external command frequency. They found it almost immediately, a testament to its strength and pervasiveness. It was a low-frequency broadcast, so subtle and persistent that it had been previously dismissed by the wall's automated systems as background noise, a meaningless hum in the vast electronic symphony of the base. But when they isolated it and amplified it, its true nature became terrifyingly clear. It was a complex, layered signal, a stream of data that was utterly alien. It had a strange, chittering quality, like the sound of a million insects clicking in unison. It was the language of the harvesters. The signal was being beamed from somewhere deep in Sector Gamma 9, a single powerful broadcast originating from the heart of the battlefield. And the node in Private Tereshkov's brainstem was locked onto it, receiving a constant stream of data. It was a leash, connecting the puppet to the puppeteer across hundreds of kilometers of dead land. Thorne and his team worked feverishly, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of their consoles. They were mapping the signal, trying to understand its structure, its purpose. Then they made the second, even more chilling discovery. The node in Tereshkov's head was not just a receiver. It was also a transmitter, a very weak one, but it was broadcasting a signal of its own. It was a feedback loop, a tiny, I am here ping that connected it back to the source. It was one small part of a much larger network. Get the Hippocrates on the line, Thorne commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. I want them to rescan the biosignatures in Gamma 9, but this time, I don't want them looking for life. I want them to scan for this specific frequency. I want to know how many of these nodes are active. The request was relayed to the medical frigate in orbit. The team on the Hippocrates, already on edge from the strange biological readings, recalibrated their sensors. Instead of sweeping for the faint electrical patterns of human life, they began to hunt for the unique alien signature of the ghost signal. The tactical map on the Aegis Wall's command deck, which had been displaying the thousands of green life signs, was wiped clean. For a moment, it was black. Then a new set of icons began to appear. They didn't flicker on like the biosigns had. They snapped into existence with digital precision. Each icon represented a detected broadcast node. One appeared, then 10, then 100, then 1,000. Within a minute, the map was once again populated with thousands of points of light. But this time, they weren't the hopeful green of life. They were a cold, hard, analytical blue. Each blue icon was a confirmation of Thorne's worst fears. Each one represented a fallen soldier, a corpse reanimated and enslaved by a harvester parasite. The map was no longer a chart of potential survivors. It was the deployment map of an enemy army, an army of our own dead, waiting for their orders. The miracle of the resurrection was a lie. The truth was a network, a vast, silent, interconnected web of death, with each of our fallen soldiers serving as a node. And the single, isolated patient in their quarantine bay was the first node to come online within their own walls. He was their connection to the entire network. As Thorne stared at the map, a horrifying thought struck him. The signal was a data stream. What data was it sending? He tasked his team with a new, desperate objective: try to decipher the signal, not to understand the language, but to understand the content. What were the harvesters saying to their army of the dead? As his team began the impossible task of cracking an alien code, the chittering, insect-like sound of the ghost signal filled the lab, a constant, terrifying reminder of the 10,000 puppets waiting in the dust, and the unseen master who was about to make them dance. The moment of activation was not dramatic. There was no sudden surge of power, no climactic event. It was as subtle and chilling as the silence that had preceded it. In Dr. Thorne's lab, a tech monitoring the ghost signal's amplitude suddenly looked up from his console, his face pale. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The signal, the primary broadcast from Gamma 9, its energy output just tripled." Simultaneously, in the quarantine bay, Private Tereshkov moved. For the first time since he had been brought in, he took a deliberate action. His head, which had been cocked at that unnatural angle, snapped straight. His arms, which had been hanging limply at his sides, rose and fell in a stiff mechanical motion. He turned, his movements precise and economical, and began to walk towards the reinforced plasteel door of his cell. He didn't run or charge. He simply walked, with the calm, inexorable purpose of a machine that has just been switched on. He reached the door and began to pound on it with his fists, the sound a steady, rhythmic, metallic boom that echoed through the medical wing. Boom, boom, boom. It was the sound of a drumbeat, signaling the start of a war. Out in the desolate plains of Sector Gamma 9, the response was instantaneous and absolute. As if moved by a single collective will, 10,000 corpses rose from the dust. From the high-altitude drone feeds, it was a sight of pure, unadulterated horror. The landscape, which had been still for days, suddenly writhed with motion. Bodies pulled themselves from the reddish soil, their movements jerky and spastic at first, like newborn animals learning to use their limbs. They rose from shallow, unmarked graves, from the wreckage of armored vehicles, from the bottom of dusty craters. They were a silent, shambling army, their tattered uniforms blending in with the rust-colored terrain. There was no order to their formation, no ranks or squads. It was a horde, a single massive entity composed of thousands of individual bodies. They all turned in unison, a ripple of movement that spread across the entire sector in seconds. They all faced the same direction, towards the massive, imposing structure of the Aegis Wall. And then, they began to march. On the wall, the alarms blared, a cacophony of sirens and automated warnings that shattered the tense quiet. "Mass motion detected," the system announced, its voice devoid of the panic that was seizing every human heart. "Sector Gamma 9, 10,000 plus contacts, all hostiles, all advancing on our position." The hopeful narrative of survivors and miracles evaporated in an instant, replaced by a stark and terrifying reality. The soldiers scrambled to their battle stations, their faces a mixture of disbelief and grim resolve. They had trained for invasions, for assaults by alien ships and monstrous creatures. They had never trained for this. They had never prepared to aim their weapons at the familiar faces of their own comrades. Through her high-powered scope, Sergeant Eva Rostova watched the nightmare unfold. The horde was a roiling sea of death, a moving carpet of resurrected flesh. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. It was the entire 88th Mechanized Infantry, risen from their graves and turned against them. Her hands were steady now, the earlier trembling replaced by a cold, hard certainty. The trap she had sensed was no longer a premonition. It was a shambling, undeniable reality. She began to scan the faces of the approaching dead, her movements methodical, detached. It was a grim, necessary task. She had to know. She had to be sure. The part of her that was a sister, the part that had held on to a microscopic sliver of hope against all logic, had to be silenced. The soldier had to take over. The soldier had to be ready to kill what was coming. The horde advanced, their pace slow but relentless, a tide of death that would not be stopped. The silence of Gamma 9 was finally broken, replaced by the soft, shuffling sound of 10,000 pairs of dead feet marching towards home. The voice of High Command crackled over the Aegis Wall's primary channel, cutting through the blare of the alarms. It was the voice of Fleet Admiral Jorik, a man whose face was known throughout the colonies, a symbol of humanity's unified defiance. His tone, usually resonant with confidence and authority, was now strained, thin, and stripped of all its political polish. The carefully constructed narrative of the miracle of Gamma 9 had crumbled in a matter of minutes, and the reality was now being broadcast on every tactical channel. "To all personnel stationed at the Aegis Wall," Yorick began, his voice heavy with a weight that felt personal, palpable even across the vast distance from Titan. "The advancing contacts have been designated Class G hostiles. The Ghost Protocol is confirmed active. The use of the term, once a whispered legend, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through the ranks. It was official. The boogeyman was real. The entity is approaching your position, the Admiral continued, his words carefully chosen yet utterly devastating. Are not our soldiers. They are biomechanical weapons controlled by the enemy. They are no longer human. I repeat, they are no longer human. There was a pause, a moment of dead air that felt like an eternity, as if the Admiral himself was struggling to voice the command that had to follow. The standing orders for engagement are hereby rescinded. The new directive is absolute. You are to engage any and all advancing hostiles with lethal force. Do not hesitate. Do not attempt to communicate. Do not attempt to disable. Your objective is the complete and total annihilation of the approaching force. Fire at will. Fire to destroy. There are no friendlies in Sector Gamma 9. Jorik out. The channel clicked off, leaving behind a silence more profound than the alarms. The order was simple, direct, and militarily necessary. It was also the most monstrous command any soldier on that wall had ever received. They were being ordered to commit a massacre. To aim their weapons at the bodies of their friends, their mentors, their bunkmates, their family, and to obliterate them. It was a psychological poison injected directly into the heart of the defense. On the battlements, the soldiers looked at each other, their faces pale under the harsh glare of the emergency lights. They were professionals, trained to follow orders without question. But this order was different. It went against every instinct, every value that had been drilled into them. You do not fire on your own uniform. You do not desecrate the bodies of your fallen comrades. This command forced them to do both. A young private, no older than Alek had been, vomited into a waste receptacle, his body trembling. A hardened sergeant, a man with decades of service, simply stared out at the approaching horde, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He was looking at the faces of men he had trained, men he had led into battle. Now he was being ordered to execute them. The automated defense systems, devoid of sentiment or hesitation, were the first to obey. The targeting arrays, which had been tracking the survivors with non-lethal protocols, now reclassified them as enemy targets. Red targeting boxes appeared on the main view screen, overlaying the shambling figures. The system began to calculate firing solutions, prioritizing the densest clusters of the horde. There was a low hum as the massive plasma cannons in the wall's turrets charged, their barrels glowing with a malevolent blue-white energy. The soldiers had a few minutes, perhaps less, before the horde was in effective range of their personal weapons. A few minutes to process the unthinkable, to reconcile their duty with their humanity. They had to force themselves to see the approaching figures not as the men and women they had known, but as what the Admiral had called them: weapons. They had to kill the memory of their friends before they could kill the bodies. It was an act of psychological self-mutilation, a necessary amputation of the soul in order to survive the next few hours. The order had been given. The unthinkable was now the mission. For Sergeant Eva Rostova, the Admiral's order was not a shock. It was a confirmation. It was the cold, hard, logical conclusion to the dread she had been nursing for days. While others around her reacted with disbelief and horror, Eva felt a strange, grim sense of clarity. The ambiguity was gone. The false hope was extinguished. There was only the enemy and the mission. She methodically began her pre-battle ritual, checking the charge on her stanchion railgun, calibrating her scope, and regulating her own breathing. She was a soldier. This was her purpose. She brought the scope to her eye, the world outside her nest dissolving into a magnified, pixelated view of the battlefield. The horde was closer now, close enough for the advanced optics to render individual details with chilling precision. She swept the scope across the front ranks of the dead, her mind detached, analytical. She was looking for command structures, for patterns, for any sign of tactical organization, but there was none. It was just a wave of bodies, a chaotic, shambling mass. She forced herself to look at the faces. Tereshkov, the harmonica player. Sergeant Kovic, a bear of a man who had taught her hand-to-hand combat. Private Lynn, a young woman who had been a brilliant engineer. She saw them all, their faces slack and empty, their eyes like polished stones. With each phase, she felt a small, sharp pang of loss, which she immediately suppressed. It was a distraction. It was a weakness, and then she saw him. Her methodical scan stuttered and stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. The detached professional soldier she had forced herself to become shattered in an instant, and all that was left was a sister, staring at a nightmare. It was Alek, her brother. He was not in the front, but slightly back, part of a cluster of what must have been his own squad. His uniform was torn, his face smudged with the same grime from his last video message, but it was unmistakably him. His eyes were the same as the others, vacant and soulless. His movements had the same unnatural, jerky quality. He held his pulse rifle clutched in his hands, but not with the practiced ease of a soldier. He held it like an object, an extension of his arm that he didn't quite understand. He was a puppet, a shell, a grotesque parody of the vibrant, loving brother she remembered. Time seemed to slow down. The blaring alarms, the shouts of her comrades, the hum of charging weapons, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. Her world narrowed to the circular view of her scope, to the face of her dead brother walking towards her to kill her. Every memory she had of him rushed through her mind at once, teaching him to ride a hoverbike, arguing with him about joining the infantry, the pride she felt seeing him in his uniform, his last smiling message. "See you on the other side, Eva." He was on the other side now, and he had come back for her. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her. Her finger, which had been resting calmly on the trigger of her rifle, now felt alien and heavy. The weapon in her hands, an instrument of her profession, suddenly felt like a tool for committing the ultimate act of desecration. The Admiral's words echoed in her head. "They are not our people." But the face in her scope was her brother. It was her blood. The horror was not just that he was dead and walking. The horror was that she was now tasked with killing him again. To fire a weapon at that face, to watch his body be torn apart by the force of her own shot, was a violation so profound she could not comprehend it. The cold, hard clarity she had felt moments before was gone, replaced by a paralyzing emotional agony. Her duty as a soldier was in direct, violent conflict with her most fundamental identity as a sister. And as the horde shuffled ever closer, Sergeant Eva Rostova remained frozen, her scope fixed on the ghost of her brother, trapped in a moment of pure, undiluted horror. The first shot of the battle was not fired by human hands. It was fired by the cold, impartial logic of the Aegis Wall's automated defense system. The moment the leading edge of the horde crossed a predetermined engagement line, a line invisible in the dust but absolute in the system's code, the wall unleashed its fury. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the entire structure, a sound that you felt in your bones before you heard it. Then, the main plasma cannons fired. Beams of incandescent blue-white energy, thick as starship support columns, lanced out from the turrets. They struck the front ranks of the horde with cataclysmic force. The impact was silent for a moment, the energy so intense it vaporized everything it touched before the sound could escape. Then the thunderclap hit, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the wall. Where the beam struck, the earth was glassed into obsidian. Dozens of the reanimated bodies were instantly annihilated, their forms dissolving into superheated vapor and scattered ash. The sheer destructive power was absolute. For a split second, there was a sense of grim satisfaction among the defenders. The cannons were working. The enemy could be destroyed. But the satisfaction was short-lived. The horde did not react as any living army would. There was no panic, no attempt to take cover, no faltering in their advance. The bodies behind the newly created craters simply walked into them and out the other side, shuffling over the still glowing ground without hesitation. The gaps in their ranks were filled instantly as the mass of bodies pressed forward. They absorbed the losses as if they were nothing, a minor inconvenience. They were a tide, and the plasma cannons were just rocks in their path. The tide simply flowed around them. Then the secondary weapon systems came online. The automated pulse turrets, smaller and faster firing, opened up. A storm of golden energy bolts rained down on the horde. Unlike the plasma cannons, these bolts didn't vaporize. They punched clean through the reanimated bodies. A single bolt could core out a soldier's torso, leaving a gaping, cauterized hole. The ghosts were riddled with dozens of shots. Arms were blown off, legs were severed, heads were disintegrated, and they kept coming. A ghost with no legs would crawl, its arms pulling its ruined torso through the dust. A ghost with its chest blown open would continue to shamble forward, its internal mechanics sparking and exposed. A ghost with no arms would simply walk, a mindless target absorbing fire that might have been aimed at the more intact puppet behind it. They felt no pain. They felt no fear. They had no concept of self-preservation. Their programming was simple and absolute. Advance. The sight was profoundly demoralizing for the human soldiers watching from the battlements. They were witnessing the complete negation of their military doctrine. They were trained to use suppressive fire, to inflict casualties, to break an enemy's morale and force a retreat. But how do you suppress an enemy that doesn't care about being shot? How do you break the morale of an army that has no morale to begin with? The battlefield became a surreal canvas of destruction. The ground was littered with crawling torsos, severed limbs, and bodies riddled with holes, all still moving, still trying to fulfill their final, terrible command. The defenders were inflicting what should have been catastrophic, battle-winning casualties, but the Horde's advance didn't slow in the slightest. It was like trying to stop the ocean by shooting it. The first volley had been a terrifying success, and a complete failure. It had demonstrated the power of their weapons and the utter futility of their situation in the same horrifying moment. The ghosts were not an army to be fought, but a plague to be weathered, and the storm had only just begun to break against the walls. Eva remained frozen at her post, a statue of indecision. The battle raged around her, a symphony of destruction that she was deaf to. Her entire universe was the face in her scope. Alek, her squad leader, a grizzled sergeant named Marcus, was screaming at her, his voice a distorted rasp over the squad's private comm channel. "Rostova, what are you doing? Engage! Fire your weapon. That's an order." Eva didn't respond. Her finger was on the trigger, but her muscles refused to obey. A lifetime of love and protection, the instinct to shield her younger brother from harm, was at war with years of brutal military conditioning. And in that moment, the sister was winning. Firing that shot felt like a betrayal so fundamental it was tantamount to suicide. It was an act her soul refused to commit. "Eva, damn it! Snap out of it!" Marcus yelled, his voice now laced with genuine panic. He could see her in action from his position further down the wall. He knew about her brother. He knew what he was asking her to do. But he also knew that her hesitation was a danger to them all. Her stanchion railgun was one of the most powerful anti-materiel weapons on their section of the wall. It was designed to punch through armored vehicles. It was their best hope for taking out clusters of the advancing ghosts, for thinning the herd before it reached the gates. Her silence was creating a hole in their defense. The cluster of ghosts that included Alek's reanimated form was now dangerously close. They were at the base of the wall, a place where the main plasma cannons could not depress far enough to target them. They were in the domain of the infantry, the domain of rifles and grenades, and they were in Eva's designated kill zone. "This is your last warning, Sergeant," Marcus roared, his voice cracking. "Engage the enemy, or I will have you removed from your post." The threat barely registered with Eva. Her mind was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. She saw Alek stumble, his foot catching on a piece of shrapnel. He fell to one knee, and for a fleeting, insane moment, he looked exactly like he had as a child, tripping over a root in the woods behind their home. She remembered running to him, helping him up, brushing the dirt off his knees. Now, her job was to vaporize him. The ghost of Alek rose to its feet, its movements still jerky and unnatural, and continued its advance. It reached the base of the Aegis Wall, directly below Eva's position. Along with a dozen other ghosts from his former squad, he began to claw at the ferrocrete, his bare fingers scraping uselessly against the massive structure. It was a mindless, futile gesture, but it was part of a larger, more horrifying strategy that was unfolding all along the line. Marcus, seeing that Eva was a lost cause for the moment, redirected the fire of the rest of his squad. "Concentrate fire on the Rostova sector. Fill that gap. Now!" Pulse rifle bolts rained down on the cluster of ghosts below Eva's nest. 2 of them were torn apart, their bodies collapsing into heaps of ruined flesh and sparking metal. But the others, including Alek, were shielded by the angle of the wall. They were too close, too far underneath the line of fire from the battlements. Eva's breach of protocol, her single moment of hesitation, had created a weak point. A small one, but in a battle against a relentless, unthinking enemy, small weak points were all it took. The ghosts, driven by the cold logic of the harvester signal, began to congregate in that small pocket of relative safety. They were no longer just clawing at the wall. They were beginning to climb. The breach of protocol by a single soldier, born from love and grief, was about to lead to a breach of the wall itself.
The true, insidious genius of the Ghost Protocol was not just its psychological impact, it was its tactical brilliance. The harvesters were using the fallen soldiers' own bodies as the primary weapons of the assault. At the base of the wall, the scene devolved into a medieval nightmare given a futuristic, technological twist. The ghosts did not use siege ladders or explosive. They used themselves. In the sector where Eva had failed to fire, the cluster of reanimated soldiers began to form a grotesque, writhing pyramid of bodies. One ghost would brace itself against the wall, and another would climb onto its shoulders. Then a third would climb onto the second. They were clumsy, their movements uncoordinated, but they were relentless. They fell, their bodies breaking on the hard ground, only to have the nanites within them begin the slow, horrific process of repair. Then they would get up and try again. The defenders on the wall watched in stunned horror. They fired down into the mass of bodies, their pulse rifles tearing limbs and heads from the climbing ghost. But it didn't matter. A ghost that lost its head would continue to serve as a foothold for the one above it. A ghost that lost its arms would brace its torso against the pile. Every corpse was a resource. Every body was a brick in the ladder. They were building a ramp of their own dead, a ramp that grew higher with every casualty the defenders inflicted. All along the base of the wall, similar horrors were unfolding. Ghosts with heavy ordnance still strapped to their backs from the battle in Gamma 9 would shamble towards the main gates. They wouldn't try to disarm the explosives. They would simply walk into the gates and wait for a stray shot to detonate them. They were living, walking bombs. The defenders had to choose between letting them get close or shooting them and triggering the very explosion they were trying to prevent. The battle for the main gate was a scene of pure chaos. The ghosts swarmed the entrance, not with tactics, but with sheer, overwhelming pressure. They piled up against the massive blast doors, their combined weight putting immense strain on the hydraulic. They clawed at the seams, their fingers breaking and tearing, the nanites within them already working to mend the damage. Machine gun turrets mounted above the gate sprayed a constant stream of fire into the crowd, turning the area into a charnel house. But the bodies, both the living and the truly dead, just kept piling up, creating a gruesome barricade that absorbed the fire and protected the ghosts behind it. For the soldiers fighting on the wall, the psychological strain was becoming unbearable. This was not combat. It was extermination. It was a close-quarters abattoir. They were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting a tide of meat. The enemy didn't scream when shot. They didn't bleed in a way that felt natural. They just broke, sparked, and kept coming. The familiar sights and sounds of battle were gone, replaced by something alien and profoundly disturbing. The human ladder in Eva's sector was now alarmingly high. It was a writhing, trembling structure of interconnected bodies, reaching halfway up the wall. The ghosts at the top, their faces empty and their eyes vacant, were clawing at the edge of the battlements. A young private leaned over too far, trying to get a clear shot, and a hand shot out from the pile. It grabbed him by the front of his armor and pulled. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror, as he was dragged over the edge and into the mass of writhing bodies below. He was torn apart in seconds. The horrors were no longer just at the gate. They were coming over the top. The wall was about to be breached.
While the battle raged on the wall, Dr. Eris Thorne was fighting a different kind of war in the sterile confines of his laboratory. He was surrounded by holographic screens displaying cascading lines of alien code, energy waveforms, and biological schematics. The chittering sound of the ghost signal was a constant, maddening presence. He had ignored the panicked shouts over the comms, the reports of the breach. He knew that shooting the ghosts was a temporary solution, a losing battle of attrition. The only way to win was to cut the strings of the puppets, and to do that, he had to understand the puppeteer. He and his small team were in a desperate race against time, trying to analyze the ghost signal. They had quickly realized that deciphering the alien language was impossible. But they didn't need to understand the words. They needed to understand the function. Thorn, with his unique background in xenobiology and alien technology, began to see a pattern not in the content of the signal, but in its structure. "It's not just a command signal," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of nonstop work. "It's a learning network, a hive-mind." He pointed to a complex diagram on one of the screens. "Look here. The main broadcast from Gamma 9 is the command layer. It's the advance order. But there's a secondary layer, a mesh network running between the ghosts themselves." His team stared at the diagram, the horrifying implication dawning on them. The parasitic nodes in the soldiers' brains were not just receivers, they were transceivers. They were sharing data with each other. "When a ghost is destroyed," Thorn explained, his finger tracing a line of data that had spiked just moments after a plasma cannon blast, "its node sends out a final packet of data. It's reporting on the cause of its death. The type of weapon used, the angle of attack, the structural failure points. It's sharing its experience with the rest of the horde." The room fell silent. The ghosts were learning. They were adapting. The harvesters were using the deaths of our own soldiers as a real-time combat simulation to refine the horde's tactics. The initial clumsy assault was just the beginning. The horde was getting smarter with every casualty they took. "That's why they're forming the ladders," a young tech breathed, her face ashen. "That's why they're using bodies as shields. They aren't just mindless zombies. They're a distributed tactical network. They're learning how to defeat us." Thorn's mind raced. The initial strategy of the ghosts had been based on the harvesters' alien understanding of warfare, a simple, overwhelming frontal assault. But now, they were augmenting that strategy with a more dangerous element: human military knowledge. "The nodes are not just controlling the bodies," Thorn said, a new layer of horror in his voice. "They have access to the host's brain. Not the consciousness, that's gone, but the lower functions, the cerebellum, the muscle memory." He brought up another screen showing the biotelemetry from the fallen soldiers of the 88th. These men and women were expert soldiers. Their bodies know how to fight, how to take cover, how to aim, how to move efficiently in combat. The harvesters are tapping into that. They are downloading the muscle memory of our own veterans and using it against us. The seemingly random, shambling movements of the horde were a feint. Beneath the surface, the network was processing data, learning from its mistakes, and accessing the latent combat skills of its hosts. The human ladders, the suicidal bombing runs, these were just the first crude applications of this new knowledge. Soon, the ghosts might start using their weapons with the deadly proficiency of the soldiers they once were. They were fighting a self-improving enemy, an army that turned every defeat into a lesson. Thorn's race was no longer just about understanding the signal. He had to find a way to disrupt it, to crash the network, before the army of the dead learned to fight like the elite soldiers they used to be. Thorn knew he couldn't block the ghost signal. The broadcast from Gamma 9 was too powerful, too pervasive. It was like trying to build a dam against a tsunami with a handful of sand. Jamming it was also not an option. The frequency was unlike anything in their arsenal, and attempting to broadcast a counter-frequency without understanding its properties could have unforeseen, potentially catastrophic consequences. He needed a different approach. He needed to get inside the network, not just observe it. "If we can't block it, maybe we can listen to it," he theorized, his mind working at a feverish pace. "The nodes are transceivers. They're talking to each other. If we can isolate the frequency of that mesh network, the whisper between the ghosts, we might be able to inject something into it. A virus, a piece of corrupted data, something to disrupt the hive mind." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a dozen unproven assumptions. but it was the only play they had left. His team set to work, reconfiguring their most sensitive sensors to filter out the overwhelming roar of the main command signal and focus on the faint, almost imperceptible chatter of the mesh network. It was like trying to hear a whisper in the middle of a hurricane. They used the node from Private Tereshkov's body, which was still rhythmically pounding on his cell door, as their Rosetta Stone. It was their one known friendly in a sea of enemies. By focusing on the specific frequency of its "I am here" ping, they could begin to map its connections to the other nodes just outside the wall. After an hour of painstaking work, they succeeded. They isolated the whisper network. On their screens, the sound of the main signal's chittering was replaced by something far quieter, but infinitely more sinister. It was a soft, flowing stream of clicks and pulses, a sound like rain on a tin roof, interspersed with what sounded like distorted, fragmented human voices. "What is that?" a tech asked, pointing to a waveform that corresponded with one of the voice-like sounds. Thorne leaned in, his face inches from the screen. He ran a descrambling algorithm, not to translate, but to clarify. The distorted sound resolved into a single, clear word, spoken in the voice of a dead soldier. "Cover," it said before dissolving back into static. Another fragment emerged a few seconds later. "Suppressing fire." Then another. "Flank left." A cold wave of nausea washed over Thorne. He finally understood. The network wasn't just sharing abstract data. It was sharing the last tactical thoughts and combat instincts of the soldiers as they died. The Harvesters had created a system that strip-mined the final, desperate moments of our soldiers' lives for tactical information. The whisper of the network was made of the echoes of dying men. It was a chorus of ghosts, their last words twisted into a weapon to be used against their own. The discovery was monstrous, but it also presented an opportunity. The network was processing human-derived data. It was designed to handle the logic of combat, the geometry of a firefight. But it was an alien system. It was rigid, logical, and likely had no understanding of the chaotic, illogical, and overwhelmingly powerful force that underpinned every human action: emotion. "That's it," Thorne whispered, a wild, desperate idea forming in his mind. "The system is processing tactics, but it can't process the reason for the tactics. It understands the how of fighting, but not the why. It doesn't understand fear or rage or love or grief." He looked at his team, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "We can't fight their logic, so we'll attack them with chaos. We're not going to inject a virus. We're going to inject a soul." His plan was insane, a shot in the darkest of nights. He was going to flood the network of the dead with the one thing it was not designed to handle: the raw, unfiltered experience of being alive.
The groaning sound of stressed metal was the first sign. It was a low, tortured sound that cut through the din of battle, a sound of something massive giving way. On the section of the wall directly below Eva's nest, the human ladder of ghosts had succeeded. The constant, combined pressure of dozens of bodies, augmented by the unnatural strength granted by the harvester nanites, had found a weak point, a seam between two massive ferrocrete plates. With a final, coordinated push, they tore the plate loose. It fell with a deafening crash, creating a gaping, jagged hole in the wall's seemingly impenetrable facade. Dust and debris filled the air. For a moment there was a stunned silence, a collective intake of breath from the defenders. The wall, their symbol of safety and defiance, their last bastion against the horrors of the universe, had been broken. Then the ghosts poured through. They didn't swarm in with a tactical rush. They spilled through the opening like grain from a torn sack, a clumsy, stumbling, but unstoppable flood of reanimated flesh. They were inside. The fight was no longer at the gates or on the battlements. It was now in the corridors and service tunnels of the Aegis Wall itself. The nature of the battle changed instantly from a siege defense to a desperate, close-quarters brawl for survival. Alarms, different and more frantic than before, blared through the interior of the base. "Warning! Containment breach in Sector Delta 7. All personnel, repel boarders." Automated blast doors began to slam shut, an attempt to isolate the breach, but it was too late. Dozens of ghosts were already inside, spreading into the labyrinthine corridors of the wall. The fighting that ensued was a special kind of hell. The wide-open spaces of the battlements were replaced by narrow, claustrophobic hallways. There was no room to maneuver, no place to fall back to. It was face-to-face combat with the dead. Soldiers, trained for ranged warfare, found themselves locked in brutal struggles with enemies who did not tire, did not feel pain, and did not stop until they were physically torn to pieces. A squad of defenders, responding to the breach, rounded a corner and came face-to-face with a group of ghosts. The soldiers raised their pulse rifles, but they were too close. A ghost, its face a mask of vacant indifference, lunged forward and grabbed the barrel of a soldier's rifle. The soldier, reacting on instinct, pulled the trigger. The bolt fired, obliterating the ghost's head, but its body, still animated by the node, completed the motion, using the rifle as a lever to pull the soldier off balance. Another ghost stepped forward and tore the man apart. The psychological toll was immense. It was one thing to shoot at a distant, shambling figure from the safety of a fortified wall. It was another thing entirely to have the corpse of your former training sergeant grab you, his dead eyes inches from your own, his hands possessing a cold, unnatural strength. The fighting was intimate, visceral, and horrifying. Soldiers screamed as they were overwhelmed, their cries echoing through the metallic corridors. Morale, already strained to the breaking point, began to shatter completely. The wall was not just breached, it was compromised, infected. The ghosts were inside the machine.
The battle for the interior of the Aegis Wall was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a series of desperate, chaotic skirmishes fought in flickering emergency lights and smoke-filled corridors. It was a meat grinder. The ghosts, now operating inside the confined spaces, began to exhibit the first terrifying signs of their network's tactical evolution. They were no longer just shambling forward. They were using the environment. A ghost would stand motionless in a darkened alcove, its cold body emitting no heat signature, until a squad of soldiers passed by. Then it would lurch out, attacking the last man in the formation. They began to move with a terrifying, coordinated purpose, a group of them pinning down a squad with mindless, inaccurate fire, while another group advanced silently down a parallel corridor to flank them. They were using the basic tactical knowledge downloaded from the minds of the soldiers they inhabited. For the human defenders, every corner turned was a gamble. Every shadow could hold a waiting enemy. But the true horror was not the tactics. It was the faces. The fight became a series of deeply personal, tragic confrontations. A soldier would come face to face with the reanimated corpse of the man who had been his best friend, the best man at his wedding. He would see the familiar face, the same height, the same build, but behind the eyes there was nothing but the cold, alien intent of the harvester signal. These moments of recognition were deadly. A split second of hesitation, a brief, involuntary recoil from the horror of seeing a loved one's face on a monster, was all the opening a ghost needed. Many soldiers died because they could not bring themselves to pull the trigger on a friend, even a dead one. Sergeant Marcus, Eva's squad leader, found himself cornered in a maintenance bay with two of his remaining soldiers. They were holding a doorway against a dozen ghosts. One of the ghosts at the front of the pack was a young woman, Private Anya. Marcus had personally recommended her for a commendation just 2 weeks ago, for her bravery during a skirmish in the outer sectors. Now her body, riddled with pulse rifle holes, was being used as a mobile shield by the ghosts behind her. She kept advancing, her arms outstretched, her face a blank slate. "Sir, what do we do?" One of the soldiers next to Marcus cried out, his voice cracking with panic. Marcus stared at the face of Private Anja, the promising young soldier he had mentored. He saw the pride in her eyes when he had told her she was one of the best he'd ever trained. He hardened his heart, the pain a physical thing in his chest. "She's not Anja anymore," he gritted out, raising his rifle. "She's a weapon, and we break weapons. Fire!" They unleashed a concentrated volley, tearing the body of Private Anja apart, along with the two ghosts directly behind her. The victory felt like a funeral. With every ghost they killed, they were killing a memory, a piece of their own past. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one for the survival of the wall, and another for their own sanity. And they were losing ground on both. The dead were relentless, and the grief was a weapon as potent as any plasma cannon. The breach of the wall jolted Eva from her paralysis. The distant thunder of the main cannons was one thing. The immediate, visceral sound of fighting and screaming from within the wall itself was another. The shock of the breach, the imminent threat to her squad mates, finally overrode the grief that had frozen her. The soldier, buried under an avalanche of sorrow, clawed its way back to the surface. She didn't hesitate. She abandoned her sniper's nest, her powerful railgun useless in the close quarters fighting that was now unfolding. Grabbing her standard-issue pulse rifle, she scrambled down the ladder and ran towards the sounds of battle, her movements once again fluid and professional. She was no longer a sister in mourning. She was a sergeant, and her people were in danger. She found what was left of her squad pinned down in a T-junction, holding back a tide of ghosts pouring from the main breach. Sergeant Marcus was there, his face grim, firing controlled bursts into the shambling mass. Eva, glad you could join us," he yelled over the roar of gunfire, his voice a mixture of relief and anger. "We need to seal that breach, plant charges on the support struts, and bring the ceiling down on them." It was a desperate, suicidal plan, but it was the only one they had. They had to cut off the flow of ghosts, or the entire sector of the wall would be lost. Eva took her position, her rifle becoming an extension of her body. She fired with cold, deadly precision, aiming for the head, the one guaranteed way to disable a ghost by destroying its control node. One shot, one kill. The muscle memory of 1,000 firefights took over. They began to fight their way towards the breach, a slow, brutal advance down a corridor filled with their dead comrades. For Eva, the world became a narrow tunnel of violence. The faces of the ghosts were a blur, just targets to be neutralized. She was in the zone, a state of pure combat focus, her emotions locked away in a steel box. And then, the box broke open. As they neared the gaping hole in the wall, a figure stepped through the dust and debris. It was Alek. His ghost, having been one of the first to climb the wall of bodies, was now inside. He stood there, framed by the jagged opening, the red light of the dying sun and gamma-9 silhouetting his form. He turned his head and his vacant eyes locked onto her. The world fell away again. The sounds of the battle, the shouts of Marcus, the roar of her own pulse rifle. It all vanished. There was only her and the reanimated corpse of her brother, standing 20 feet away. The ghost of Alek began to advance on her. It moved with a purpose the others had lacked. It ignored the other soldiers, its path unwavering, its dead eyes fixed on her. The network, the hive-mind, had recognized her. Perhaps it was her prolonged stare from the sniper's nest, or her genetic similarity to the host body. Whatever the reason, the alien intelligence controlling her brother had identified her as a unique target. Marcus screamed her name. "Eva, shoot!" But she couldn't. Not again. She was face to face with her greatest horror, and her finger refused to obey. The ghost of Alek raised its rifle, its movements a clumsy, horrifying parody of the soldier he had been. It was going to kill her, using the body of the person she loved most in the universe. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The ghost of Alek stood before her, his pulse rifle leveling at her chest. Eva stood frozen, her own weapon half raised, her mind screaming but her body refusing to act. This was it. The end. Killed by her own brother's hand, but the shot never came. Instead, something impossible happened. The ghost of Alek faltered. Its head twitched violently to the side, a spastic, unnatural jerk. Its rifle arm trembled, the barrel dipping towards the floor. A low, guttural sound, like a distorted recording, emanated from its throat. It was a sound of struggle. For a split second, a flicker of something ancient and human returned to its eyes. The vacant, stony emptiness was replaced by a flash of confusion, of pain. It was a ghost in the machine, a fragment of the real Alek, the soul of her brother, momentarily surfacing through the alien control, awakened by the sight of his sister in peril. It was a glitch, a miracle. In that single, impossible moment, it was not a harvester puppet standing before her. It was her brother. He was in there, somewhere, fighting against his own body, fighting against the parasitic node that had enslaved him. The network was trying to force him to fire, but some deep residual part of him, a memory of love and protection buried in the neurons of his brainstem, was resisting. It was an act of rebellion from beyond the grave. The moment was fleeting, lasting no more than a heartbeat. But it was enough. It was the proof Eva needed. He was not just a weapon. He was not just a corpse. He was Alek, and he was a prisoner in his own body. The sight of his struggle, his spectral defiance, broke her paralysis. It filled her not with grief, but with a burning, righteous fury. The harvesters had not just killed her brother, they had defiled him, turned him into a slave, and he was still fighting. She had to fight too. The flicker of recognition in Alek's eyes vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The alien control reasserted itself, the stony emptiness returning. His rifle began to rise again, but it was too late. The moment of connection, the ghost of her brother's love, had given Eva what she needed. It had given her a reason to fight back. Not to kill her brother, but to free him. To grant him the peace he was being denied. Her aim was no longer clouded by sorrow. It was sharpened by love. "It's ready," Dr. Thorne announced, his voice raw and strained. On the main screen in his lab, a single pulsating icon labeled Soul Virus was blinking. His desperate gambit was prepared. It was not a virus in the traditional sense. It was a data packet of pure, weaponized humanity. Working with his team, Thorne had compiled a chaotic, unstructured stream of sensory and emotional data. They had taken the recorded laughter of a child from a soldier's personal log, the sound of a symphony from the cultural archives, the biofeedback from a pilot experiencing extreme G-forces, the tearful wedding vows of a comms officer, the raw, unfiltered rage of a soldier in his last stand. They had woven together thousands of these fragments: love, hate, joy, sorrow, pain, pleasure, into a single massive data file. It was the antithesis of the cold, ordered logic of the ghost signal. It was a digital scream of the human experience. "The plan is simple," Thorne explained to the Wall's commander over a secure channel, his voice racing against the sounds of battle in the background. "The main comms tower has the power to broadcast on a wide enough frequency to piggyback on the ghost signal. We're going to upload this packet and broadcast it directly into the hive-mind. We're going to flood the network with emotional, illogical, chaotic data." "And what will that do?" the commander asked, his voice skeptical. "I don't know," Thorne admitted, the honesty chilling. "My hypothesis is that the alien network is not equipped to process this kind of information. It's designed for tactical logic, not existential crisis. It might do nothing. It might cause a feedback loop that fries the entire network. It might simply confuse the ghosts long enough for us to regain control. It is a gamble, Commander, but it is the only one we have left." The commander was silent for a moment. The sounds of explosions and gunfire echoed over the comm. His forces were being slaughtered. The wall was falling. "Do it," he said, his voice filled with grim resignation. "Make it happen, Doctor." Thorne turned to his team. "You heard him. Route the packet to the main comms tower. Prepare for immediate broadcast on my mark." There was a problem. The main communications tower was located in an external courtyard, near the section of the wall that had been breached. The area was already being overrun by ghosts. To initiate the broadcast, someone would have to manually activate the upload sequence from the tower's control terminal. And the upload was not instantaneous. The file was massive. It would take 3 minutes. 3 minutes of staying alive in the heart of the swarm. "The tower's automated defenses are down," a tech reported, his face grim. "Whoever goes out there will be a sitting duck." Thorne looked at the tactical map. He saw the blinking icon of Sergeant Marcus's squad, the last pocket of organized resistance near the breach. He opened a channel directly to the sergeant's helmet. "Sergeant Marcus," Thorne said, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos. "I need you to do something for me. I need you to buy me 3 minutes."
Sergeant Marcus received Dr. Thorne's message in the middle of the firefight. The request was insane. Hold a position around the exposed comms tower for 3 minutes. It was a suicide mission. The courtyard was a kill zone, swarming with ghosts pouring through the breach. But as Thorn quickly explained the nature of his plan, the soul virus, a flicker of desperate hope ignited in Marcus's chest. It was a crazy scientist's dream, but it was better than dying in a pointless, fighting retreat. You heard the man. Marcus roared to the handful of soldiers left under his command. Eva was among them, her face set in a mask of grim determination after her encounter with Alek. We're not giving up this ground. We're making our stand here. All forces converge on the comms tower. Form a perimeter. We are buying that egghead 3 minutes if it's the last thing we do. It was a rallying cry born of desperation. The scattered defenders, who had been fighting isolated, losing battles in the corridors, heard the command. They saw the tactical marker for the new defensive position. With a renewed, if fatalistic, sense of purpose, they began to fight their way towards the courtyard. It was no longer about survival, it was about completing the mission. Eva and Marcus's squad were the first to reach the base of the towering communications antenna. It was a sleek, metallic spire, now pockmarked with stray weapons fire. At its base was a small, armored control terminal. "I'll handle the upload," a young comms tech shouted, sprinting towards the terminal. He was a kid, barely out of training, his hands trembling as he plugged his datapad into the interface. "I have the packet from Dr. Thorne. Starting the sequence now." On the screen of the terminal, a progress bar appeared. "Uploading Solander-Scorvirus.pack. 1%. The 3-minute countdown had begun. Perimeter. Now!" Marcus yelled. He and Eva and the other half-dozen soldiers of their squad formed a small, desperate circle around the tech and the terminal. They faced outward, their backs to the tower, their rifles raised. The ghosts, drawn by the concentration of living humans, began to converge on their position. The first wave came. A dozen ghosts shambled out of the smoke and shadows. The soldiers opened fire, a disciplined, controlled volley. They had learned the lesson of the battle. Aim for the head. Pulse bolts flashed in the dim light, and the ghosts fell, their control nodes exploding in a shower of sparks. But more were coming. They poured from the breach, from the adjoining corridors, a relentless tide of the dead. The progress bar on the terminal crept upwards with agonizing slowness. 15%. 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. The soldiers fired until their rifle barrels glowed red, the air thick with the smell of ozone and burnt flesh. They were holding, but they were terribly outnumbered. The last broadcast had begun, and its fate now rested in the hands of a few exhausted soldiers, making their final stand at the heart of the storm.
The courtyard became a vortex of violence. The small circle of defenders around the comms tower was the eye of the storm, a tiny island of defiance in a sea of encroaching death. The progress bar on the tech's terminal was their clock, each percentage point ticking away a lifetime. 33%. 2 minutes to go. A ghost, faster than the others, broke through their line of fire. It lunged at one of the soldiers, dragging him to the ground. The soldier screamed as he was overwhelmed. Marcus didn't hesitate. He fired a single, precise shot into the soldier's head. It was a mercy, a final act of respect to prevent him from joining the ranks of the puppets. "Close the gap," he roared. His voice hoarse, the circle shrank, becoming tighter, more desperate. They were fighting with an efficiency born of pure adrenaline. They had no time for fear. Every thought, every action was dedicated to the mission. Reload. Aim. Fire. Reload. Aim. Fire. The ground around them became a carpet of fallen ghosts, their bodies twitching and sparking before falling still. But for every one they put down, 2 more seemed to take its place. 50%. 1 minute and 30 seconds. The comms tech, his face pale with concentration, shielded the terminal with his own body as stray shots impacted the tower around him. "It's working," he yelled. "The upload is stable." A huge ghost, the reanimated body of a heavy weapons specialist, lumbered out of the smoke, a massive rotary cannon still clutched in its hands. It raised the weapon, the barrels beginning to spin. "Heavy!" Eva screamed. Before anyone could react, one of the soldiers, a man Eva only knew as Diaz, broke from the circle. He charged the heavy ghost, a plasma grenade in his hand. He didn't even try to throw it. He tackled the ghost, pressing the grenade directly into its chest and hitting the detonator. The resulting explosion was blinding, vaporizing both Diaz and the heavy ghost, and scattering the puppets around them. It was a deliberate, calculated act of self-sacrifice. It had bought them another 10 seconds, 75%. 45 seconds left. Their ammunition was running critically low. The rhythmic bark of their pulse rifles was becoming sporadic. "Switch to single shot. Conserve your energy cells," Marcus commanded. The circle was now down to just 4 defenders: Marcus, Eva, the tech, and one other soldier. They were back to back, a tiny, 4-pointed star of defiance. The ghosts, as if sensing their weakness, surged forward in a massive wave. This was it. The final push. There were too many. They would be overwhelmed in seconds. Eva raised her rifle for what she knew would be her last shot. She thought of Alek, of his moment of rebellion. She would not let these sacrifices be in vain. She would fight until the last second. The dead swarmed towards them, their empty eyes promising a cold, silent end. "It's uploaded, broadcasting now," the tech screamed, his voice a triumphant cry of defiance amidst the chaos. He slammed his hand down on the final command key. From the top of the comms tower, a new energy bloomed. It was not a beam of light or a wave of force. It was a silent, invisible pulse that washed over the battlefield. In Dr. Thorne's lab, the chittering of the ghost signal on his monitors was suddenly drowned out by a cacophony of digital noise. The soul virus was in the network. For a moment, nothing happened. The wave of ghosts continued its charge, their hands outstretched to tear the last defenders apart. Then, the overload hit. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The ghost closest to Eva, its hand just inches from her face, suddenly stopped. Its head snapped back and it let out a high-pitched shriek of pure static. The parasitic node in its brain, designed to process the cold, simple logic of combat, was being flooded with 1 billion contradictory data points. It was being force-fed the joy of a first kiss, the terror of a final breath, the complex chords of a forgotten symphony, the irrational fury of a lover's quarrel. The alien system was trying to find a tactical value in the sound of a baby's laughter, and it was breaking. All across the courtyard, the ghosts began to convulse. Their movements, once unified and purposeful, became erratic and spastic. Some clawed at their own heads, their dead fingers trying to tear out the source of the overwhelming sensory input. Others simply stood still, trembling, their limbs twitching uncontrollably. A few began to attack each other, their programming utterly corrupted. The network was having a seizure. The hive-mind was experiencing a psychotic break. The whispers of the dead soldiers' last tactical thoughts were being drowned out by a chorus of their lives. The cold, logical stream of data was being choked by a tidal wave of chaotic, beautiful, terrible humanity. Eva and Marcus could only stare in stunned disbelief. The wave of death that was about to crash down upon them had broken, dissolving into a scene of grotesque, spastic chaos. The ghosts were no longer an army. They were a collection of broken puppets with their strings cut, twitching and spasming as their alien controllers burned out. Dr. Thorne's insane gamble had worked. He had fought a technological plague with a ghost, and the ghost had won.
In the midst of the chaos, Eva's eyes found Alek. He was standing just a few feet away, caught in the same data storm as the others, but his reaction was different. While the other ghosts were convulsing in a violent, meaningless dance, Alek's body went still. He dropped his rifle, the weapon clattering to the ferrocrete floor. He slowly raised his head, and his eyes, for the second time, locked onto Eva's. The soul virus, the flood of human emotion and memory, had done more than just crash the network. For Alek, it had acted as a key. The fragments of his own life contained within the broadcast, the echoes of love, family, and identity, resonated with the last, dying embers of his own consciousness. The alien parasite in his head, reeling from the overload, lost its grip for one final, precious moment. The emptiness in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by a look of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. It was him. It was Alek. He was looking at her, truly seeing her. His lips, which had been a tight, lifeless line, parted slightly, as if he was trying to speak her name. No sound came out, but the intent was clear. It was a look of recognition, of apology, of love. In that single, silent gaze, he said everything. He said goodbye. Then, with a soft, final sigh, the light in his eyes faded. The parasitic node in his brain, unable to withstand the combination of the data flood and the host's sudden, powerful resurgence of self, overloaded and detonated. There was no explosion, just a faint, internal pop. A thin trickle of black fluid ran from his nose. His body, its strings finally and irrevocably cut, slumped to the ground, no longer a puppet, no longer a soldier, just a body. He fell at Eva's feet, finally at peace. Eva stared down at her brother's still form. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the grime and blood. The agony of his reanimation was washed away by a wave of profound, cleansing grief. He was gone. Truly gone this time. But his last act, his final gift to her, was a moment of recognition, a confirmation that the brother she loved had never truly left. He had been there, fighting, until the very end. He had given her the closure she would never have had. He had given her peace. The fall of the ghosts was as sudden as their awakening. Across the battlefield, in the courtyard and in the corridors of the wall, the reanimated soldiers collapsed in unison as their control nodes burned out. The chittering of the ghost signal went silent. The advance was over. The Aegis Wall, battered, breached, and bleeding, was held, but the silence that followed was not one of victory. It was the heavy, profound silence of a graveyard. The survivors, a handful of exhausted soldiers standing amidst a sea of their fallen comrades, looked at the carnage with hollow eyes. They had won, but the cost was written in the faces of the dead that surrounded them. They had been forced to kill their friends, their family, their heroes, not once, but twice. Eva Rostova knelt by her brother's body, her hand resting on his chest. The tears still flowed, but they were no longer tears of horror. They were tears of mourning, a final, necessary release. Sergeant Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's at peace now, Eva," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "You gave that to him." In the days that followed, the official reports would speak of a great victory, of the successful repelling of a new and terrifying enemy weapon. Dr. Thorne's soul virus would be classified, studied, and hailed as a turning point in the war. But for the men and women who had stood on the wall, there was no sense of triumph. They were left with the scars, both physical and psychological, and the haunting memories of the faces they had been forced to destroy. The Ghost Protocol had been defeated, but its true purpose had been achieved. It had inflicted a wound on the human psyche that might never heal. It had taught humanity a new kind of fear. The fear that not even in death could you escape the enemy, that your own body, your own memory, could be turned into a weapon. The silence that fell over the Aegis Wall was a heavy one, filled with the ghosts of those they had lost, and the terrible knowledge of the price they had paid to quiet them. The war would go on, but it would be a different war now, a darker war, fought by soldiers who knew that some things were worse than dying.